Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back across the blue waters of the eastern Mediterranean, toward a world of rocky hills, olive trees, smoky hearths, crowded marketplaces, and countless stories that have somehow survived for more than 2,000 years. When most people hear the words ancient Greece, they picture shining marble temples, fearless philosophers, victorious athletes, or perhaps a certain traveler named Odysseus spending years trying to find his way home. Those images are certainly part of the story, but like most famous postcards from history, they leave out quite a lot. So tonight, rather than following only kings, generals, or mythical heroes, we're going to wander through ordinary streets, dusty roads, quiet farms, noisy harbors, family homes, and the lives of people who rarely found themselves carved into marble. We'll discover what waking up in ancient Greece might actually have felt like, what people ate, what they worried about, how they dressed, how they traveled, whom they loved, whom they feared, and why simply surviving another year often counted as a respectable achievement. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these quiet journeys through history. It helps the channel more than most medieval rulers ever helped their kingdoms. Now dim the lights, settle into a comfortable position, and allow your thoughts to drift toward a coastline where the sea is never very far away, where goats somehow manage to climb cliffs that seem impossible, and where almost every hill appears to contain either an olive tree, a ruined wall, or both. One of the easiest mistakes to make about ancient Greece is imagining it as a single country. It wasn't. Not in the way we think of countries today. Instead, it was a patchwork of independent city-states, each with its own customs, rivalries, ambitions, and opinions about how civilized everyone else supposedly wasn't. Athens considered itself sophisticated. Sparta considered itself disciplined. Corinth considered itself wealthy. Thebes had its own proud traditions. Smaller communities scattered across islands and mountain valleys usually believed they deserved a little more respect than their neighbors were willing to offer. Naturally, everyone believed they were doing things properly. Mountains divided the landscape into hundreds of separate communities. Traveling from one valley to another could be surprisingly difficult, despite relatively short distances. The sea, on the other hand, became something like a remarkably convenient highway. Greek sailors became accustomed to hopping from island to island, hugging coastlines rather than venturing into open water whenever possible. If you've ever preferred taking familiar side streets instead of driving through an unfamiliar city center, you already understand something about ancient navigation. The Mediterranean rewarded confidence, but not recklessness. Storms arrived without much warning. Winds shifted unexpectedly. Pirates considered themselves entrepreneurs, with unusually flexible interpretations of property ownership. A successful voyage depended as much upon patience as courage. For many Greeks, the sea represented opportunity and danger in equal measure. Long before sunrise, fishing boats slipped quietly into dark waters while merchant vessels prepared cargoes of wine, olive oil, pottery, timber, metals, grain, and countless smaller goods that connected communities spread across hundreds of miles. The smell would have been unforgettable. Salt water mixed with fish, smoke from cooking fires, damp rope, animal hides, fresh bread, human sweat, and the faint sweetness of crushed olives waiting to become oil. Ancient cities were not especially concerned with modern concepts like sanitation or urban planning. One quickly learned where not to stand. Let's drift gently toward an ordinary morning. The first light crept over uneven rooftops, while roosters announced their opinions with complete confidence. Dogs barked at absolutely everything. Donkeys complained about beginning another day of carrying loads they had not personally volunteered to transport. Inside a modest household, someone stirred glowing embers back into a cooking fire. Breakfast was simple. Perhaps bread dipped in wine, diluted with water. Perhaps olives. Perhaps figs when available. Perhaps a little cheese made from sheep or goat milk. Meat appeared far less often than modern diners might expect. Livestock represented wealth, labor, milk, wool, and future income. Eating your sheep, too, frequently tended to reduce the number of sheep available later, which was an unfortunate business strategy. Fish, however, could be easier to obtain in coastal communities, although fresh fish often commanded surprisingly respectable prices depending upon location. Meanwhile, poorer families relied heavily upon barley rather than wheat. Barley was dependable. It tolerated rough conditions better than many crops. It also had a remarkable ability to appear in meals day after day after day. On what we might call the ancient Greek menu variety scale, barley performed admirably through sheer persistence. Children woke early. There were chores before anything resembling leisure. Water had to be collected. Animals needed feeding. Grain required grinding. Firewood disappeared astonishingly quickly. Every household operated as a small economic unit, where nearly everyone contributed according to age, ability, and circumstance. There were no weekends. Harvests ignored calendars. Goats showed little respect for holidays. Weather remained stubbornly indifferent to human scheduling. Most people spent much of their lives working simply to maintain a reasonable level of survival. That reality rarely appears in heroic epics. If you were fortunate enough to own farmland, your year revolved around seasons. Olive trees demanded patience, unlike almost any other crop. An olive tree might continue producing for generations, becoming almost part of the family itself. Some trees lived long enough to outlast the people who first planted them by centuries. There is something quietly comforting about that. Human arguments came and went. Empires rose and collapsed. The olive tree simply continued growing. Vineyards required equal care. Wine formed an important part of everyday life, but it was usually mixed with water before drinking. Consuming unmixed wine in large quantities carried a reputation for lacking self-control. Civilized people, many Greeks believed, knew how to dilute both their wine and, ideally, their tempers. Reality occasionally disagreed. Symposiums, social drinking gatherings among elite men, sometimes became enthusiastic demonstrations that moderation remained more of an aspiration than a consistent practice. Because of course it did. Meanwhile, countless ordinary farmers remained too occupied with fields to spend much time debating philosophy while reclining on cushions. Their conversations probably focused on weather, harvests, taxes, livestock, neighbors, and whether this year's crop looked slightly better or slightly worse than last year's. Some concerns remain remarkably timeless. Imagine standing beside one of those fields. The summer sun feels relentless. Cicadas fill the warm air with constant rhythmic sound. Dust clings to sandals. The scent of wild herbs rises beneath every step. In the distance, mountains shimmer beneath bright skies while somewhere beyond them, another city-state quietly argues with another city-state over boundaries, alliances, or wounded pride. Political disagreements traveled almost as efficiently as merchant ships. Ancient Greece produced remarkable thinkers, extraordinary artists, impressive architects, and innovative political experiments. It also produced an astonishing number of arguments. Disagreement almost became a cultural tradition. Citizens debated laws. Philosophers debated truth. Generals debated strategy. Neighbors debated property lines. Poets debated everything else. One suspects, even the goats occasionally held strong opinions. Now, if we step into Athens during the 5th century before the Common Era, we find perhaps the most famous city in Greek history. Its population included citizens, resident foreigners known as metics, enslaved people, women who lacked political rights, artisans, merchants, sailors, laborers, priests, children, and travelers from across the Mediterranean. The city buzzed with activity from dawn until evening. Markets overflowed with goods. Potters shaped clay into vessels that would eventually travel hundreds of miles. Blacksmiths hammered glowing metal. Perfume sellers displayed fragrant oils. Fishmongers loudly advertised today's catch. Merchants negotiated prices with varying degrees of honesty. Customers responded with equally varying degrees of skepticism. Anyone hoping for a peaceful shopping experience probably chose the wrong century. The marketplace, or agora, served as far more than a place to buy food. It functioned as the beating heart of civic life. People exchanged news. Political discussions erupted without warning. Legal disputes attracted curious spectators. Travelers shared rumors from distant ports. Professional storytellers entertained audiences. Philosophers wandered among crowds asking inconvenient questions that occasionally left listeners reconsidering assumptions they had comfortably held only moments earlier. Socrates became particularly famous for this habit. Meeting him unexpectedly may have felt rather like accidentally opening an email that politely questioned every decision you had made that week. Not everyone appreciated the experience. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the family, daily routines unfolded far from public debate. Greek households centered around the home rather than public visibility, especially for respectable women in many communities. The exact experience varied enormously depending upon wealth, location, and period. Elite women often managed extensive households, supervised servants if available, organized textile production, raised children, and oversaw stores of food and clothing. Poorer women frequently worked alongside husbands in agriculture, markets, or family businesses, because survival offered little room for rigid ideals. Historical reality often proved more flexible than social expectations suggested. Textile production alone consumed extraordinary amounts of time. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, repairing garments, creating clothing from raw wool required patience, measured not in hours but in weeks. When someone owned a well-made cloak, they genuinely valued it. Fashion changed far more slowly when producing every piece demanded months of labor. Clothing itself was elegant in its simplicity. Tunics known as chittons formed the basic garment for many men and women, though styles varied. Cloaks called himatia offered warmth during cooler weather. Sandals protected feet when available. Many poorer individuals simply went barefoot much of the time. Bright colors certainly existed, although producing expensive dyes remained costly. Purple dye extracted from sea snails became particularly associated with wealth and status. Thousands upon thousands of shellfish sacrificed themselves so someone important could look especially impressive at a banquet. History occasionally reveals surprising priorities. Speaking of banquets, food deserves another quiet visit. Despite modern restaurant menus inspired by Mediterranean cuisine, daily meals remained modest for most people. Bread remained central. Olive oil flavored countless dishes. Beans, lentils, onions, garlic, herbs, figs, grapes, and seasonal vegetables appeared regularly. Honey provided sweetness long before refined sugar entered European diets. Cheese accompanied many meals. Wine, diluted once again, remained common. Festivals and religious sacrifices offered opportunities for larger quantities of meat. These occasions combined worship with community celebration. Religion surrounded everyday existence. Temples crowned hills. Small shrines appeared beside roads. Families honored household gods. Travelers offered prayers before journeys. Farmers sought favorable harvests. Sailors requested calm seas. Parents hoped for healthy children. No clear dividing line separated religious life from ordinary life. Divine influence seemed woven through everything. Zeus ruled the sky. Athena watched over Athens. Poseidon governed the sea with famously unpredictable moods. Demeter protected agriculture. Hermes assisted travelers, merchants, and, rather appropriately, thieves. Apollo represented music, prophecy, healing, and much more besides. Artemis guarded wild places. Aphrodite inspired love. Ares embodied war. Hephaestus forged marvelous creations. Dionysus presided over wine, theater, celebration, and occasional spectacular loss of dignity. It was quite an impressive administrative structure. One curious feature of Greek religion is that the gods themselves often behaved with remarkably human flaws. They argued. They became jealous. They held grudges. They made questionable decisions. On the royal misery scale, some divine family gatherings would have scored alarmingly high. Perhaps this made them easier to understand. Perfect beings can seem distant. Complicated beings feel strangely familiar. As evening slowly approached, smoke rose from rooftops while families gathered around simple meals. Stories filled the fading light. Some told myths passed through generations. Others shared local gossip that would almost certainly become tomorrow's improved version of the same gossip. Children listened. Older relatives corrected details. Neighbors occasionally disagreed about whose memory deserved greater trust. History itself often began exactly this way. Long before scholars copied texts onto carefully prepared scrolls, countless stories survived because ordinary people remembered them, repeated them, and gently passed them forward beneath quiet evening skies where the same stars looked down upon shepherds, sailors, philosophers, merchants, mothers, children, kings, and laborers alike. And beneath those familiar constellations, another ordinary day in ancient Greece quietly came to an end, while somewhere beyond the mountains, another dawn was already preparing to rise. The first sounds of dawn would return with remarkable consistency. Long before the streets filled with conversation, before merchants arranged their stalls, and before the warmth of the Mediterranean sun settled over tiled rooftops, the day had already begun for much of the population. Ancient Greece was not a place where alarm clocks were necessary. Roosters, neighbors, livestock, and the practical demands of survival generally proved more than adequate. For most people, life was measured less by calendars than by routines. The changing seasons mattered far more than the changing years. A farmer rarely woke wondering what exciting adventure might unfold before sunset. More often, the questions were pleasantly ordinary. Would there be enough rain? Had the goats wandered farther than expected? Was the olive harvest likely to be good? Had the neighbor finally repaired the stone wall separating one field from another, or had he quietly decided that it was someone else's responsibility? The answer to that last question was surprisingly often the second. Stone walls had an almost magical tendency to become another person's problem. If we leave the bustling ports behind for a while and wander inland, the Greek countryside begins to reveal itself quite differently from the polished marble image that usually dominates paintings and documentaries. The land was beautiful, certainly, but beauty did not necessarily make life easier. The soil in much of Greece was thin and rocky. Broad, fertile plains existed, but they were relatively uncommon. Hillsides climbed steeply above narrow valleys. Farmers learned to make use of every patch of workable ground they could find. Terraces supported crops on slopes that seemed almost too steep for agriculture. Every successful harvest represented years of accumulated knowledge rather than simple good fortune. The Mediterranean climate helped and challenged in equal measure. Winters tended to be mild and wetter. Summers brought intense sunshine that baked the earth until it cracked beneath wandering sandals. Dust became a familiar companion for travelers. Wells became precious. Streams shrank. The landscape changed color as grasses faded beneath the relentless heat. Yet olive trees seemed almost pleased by the conditions. Their twisted trunks and silver-green leaves became one of the defining sights of Greece. Some groves had already existed for generations. Fathers taught sons, mothers taught daughters, and grandparents quietly reminded everyone else that these trees had survived countless difficult years before the current generation had even been born. An olive harvest demanded patience. The fruit had to be collected carefully, sometimes by hand, sometimes by gently beating branches so the olives fell onto cloth spread beneath the trees. Once gathered, they traveled to presses where heavy stone wheels crushed them into a thick paste before the precious oil was separated. Olive oil found its way into nearly every aspect of life. It flavored meals. It fueled lamps. It softened skin. Athletes rubbed it onto their bodies before exercising. Religious ceremonies used it. Merchants traded it. Entire local economies depended upon it. If ancient Greece were forced to choose a national product, olive oil would have made a remarkably persuasive candidate. Meanwhile, vineyards quietly matured nearby. Wine occupied an unusual position in Greek society. It was common enough to drink regularly, yet surrounded by expectations about proper behavior. Drinking wine was entirely acceptable. Drinking too much wine, at least according to respectable opinion, suggested poor self-control. Reality, however, occasionally wandered away from respectable opinion. The Greeks even had stories illustrating the dangers of excessive drinking. Philosophers discussed moderation with admirable confidence, while some symposium guests demonstrated impressive determination to ignore those discussions entirely, which, unsurprisingly, solved absolutely nothing. As we continue walking through the countryside, we begin meeting the people who rarely become the central characters of famous history books. A shepherd guides sheep across rocky hillsides. His cloak protects him from cool mornings, before becoming unnecessarily warm by midday. His staff helps steady each step over uneven ground. A loyal dog circles the flock with far greater enthusiasm than the sheep themselves. Days pass slowly. The rhythm hardly changes. The bells tied around animals create a gentle soundtrack that echoes through the valleys. Time feels less hurried here. Occasionally, wolves threaten livestock. More often, the greatest challenge is simply keeping curious goats from discovering increasingly creative methods of escaping perfectly adequate enclosures. Goats possessed extraordinary confidence. Fences often seem to function less as barriers than as interesting puzzles. Elsewhere, farmers guide oxen through fields using wooden plows, little changed over generations. The work is physically exhausting. Hands become rough. Shoulders ache. Summer heat settles heavily across the land. There is no shortcut. The harvest will reflect months of patient labor. Perhaps one reason Greek philosophers spent so much time discussing virtue was because daily life offered endless opportunities to practice persistence, whether one intended to become philosophical or not. Not everyone lived on farms, of course. Small villages dotted the countryside. Houses clustered around springs or crossroads where fresh water remained accessible. Buildings usually reflected local materials. Stone walls supported roofs made from timber and clay tiles where wealth allowed. Simpler homes relied upon thatch or packed earth. Most houses would appear surprisingly modest to modern eyes. Large windows were uncommon. Furniture remained limited. Storage jars lined walls. Cooking happened over open hearths. Smoke gradually darkened ceilings. Privacy in the modern sense barely existed. Families shared space efficiently because there was little alternative. Bedrooms often contained simple wooden beds or mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, or dried plant material. Blankets made from woven wool provided warmth during cooler months. Luxury mattresses with elaborate springs belonged to a future nobody could yet imagine. Sleeping comfortably depended partly upon luck and partly upon whether mosquitoes had selected your particular room for their evening gathering. Some traditions prove remarkably ancient. Let's drift gently toward another aspect of daily life that quietly shaped nearly every household: water. Modern plumbing has an astonishing ability to disappear from our thoughts until it suddenly stops working. In ancient Greece, water never disappeared from anyone's thoughts because obtaining it required constant effort. Women, children, servants, and enslaved people frequently carried large ceramic jars from public fountains or wells back to their homes. The journey might need repeating several times each day. A full water jar weighed enough to encourage careful planning. Every drop mattered. Bathing happened less frequently than many modern people might expect, although cleanliness remained important. Public bathhouses existed in some communities, and washing formed part of athletic life as well as religious purification. Still, daily showers remained approximately 2,000 years in the future. Soap, as we know it today, was uncommon. Instead, olive oil and scraping tools called strigils often removed dirt from the skin, especially after exercise. Watching someone deliberately cover themselves in oil before scraping it away may initially seem unusual. Then again, future historians will probably have equally interesting observations about 21st century skincare routines. One curious detail about Greek homes concerns lighting. After sunset, darkness arrived quickly. Without electricity, evenings depended upon small oil lamps. These lamps burned olive oil using simple wicks. The light they produced was gentle rather than bright. Reading after dark required effort. Sewing became more difficult. Conversations naturally slowed. Families often adjusted their routines according to daylight because extending activity into the night remained expensive. Darkness encouraged rest. The stars became remarkably visible. Far from modern city lights, the Milky Way stretched overhead with extraordinary clarity. Sailors navigated by familiar constellations. Farmers watched seasonal stars rise and disappear, quietly marking changes in the agricultural year. Perhaps the night sky felt larger then. Or perhaps people simply had more opportunities to notice it. Education, meanwhile, varied enormously depending upon wealth, gender, and location. In Athens, boys from prosperous families often attended schools where they learned reading, writing, arithmetic, music, poetry, and physical training. The poems of Homer occupied an especially important place. Children memorized long passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey, absorbing not only language but ideas about courage, honor, loyalty, hospitality, and human weakness. It was rather like growing up with the same stories echoing through every classroom, dinner conversation, and festival. Not every child received such opportunities. Many poorer families needed every available pair of hands for work. Education became practical. Children learned farming, weaving, pottery, fishing, metalworking, or whatever trade sustained the household. Knowledge passed directly from one generation to another. Lessons occurred through observation rather than formal lectures. Mistakes received immediate correction because mistakes sometimes broke tools, wasted materials, or frightened livestock. Livestock rarely appreciated educational experiments. Girls usually learned domestic skills within the household, although this varied across the Greek world. Managing a home demanded remarkable competence. Food storage, textile production, household accounting, childcare, religious rituals. These responsibilities required organization that rarely received public recognition. History often remembered speeches delivered in assemblies, while quietly overlooking the individuals ensuring everyone had clean clothing and something to eat afterward. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared: disease. Ancient medicine possessed genuine knowledge alongside understandable limitations. Physicians observed symptoms carefully. Some treatments proved surprisingly effective. Others rested upon theories that modern science has long since abandoned. The physician Hippocrates, whose name remains familiar today, became associated with careful observation rather than supernatural explanations for illness. Whether every work attributed to him truly came from his own hand remains uncertain, but the tradition represented an important shift toward studying disease through natural causes. Even so, illness remained frightening. Infections spread easily. Childbirth carried significant risks. Minor injuries sometimes became fatal. Average life expectancy was heavily affected by infant mortality. Many children never reached adulthood. Families understood this painful reality all too well. Perhaps this explains why religious festivals celebrating health, fertility, and divine protection held such emotional importance. Hope remained as necessary as bread. Meanwhile, Greek craftsmen quietly transformed raw materials into objects that still impress archaeologists today. Potters shaped elegant vases, decorated with black figure, and later red figure paintings. These vessels portrayed heroes, athletes, weddings, musicians, gods, and ordinary moments of daily life. Ironically, many scenes intended as everyday decoration have become priceless historical evidence. A simple drinking cup might tell us more about clothing or hairstyles than an official inscription carved into stone. History sometimes hides inside ordinary objects. The potter himself probably worried less about future archaeologists than whether the kiln would fire correctly. An overheated kiln could ruin weeks of work. Underfired pottery disappointed customers. Successful craftsmanship depended upon experience accumulated over many years. The same held true for bronze workers, carpenters, leather makers, jewelers, and shipbuilders. Ancient Greece admired excellence. There was even a word for it, arete. It suggested fulfilling one's potential with skill and distinction. A good farmer could display arete. So could an athlete, a poet, a soldier, a craftsperson. Excellence belonged to many paths, not only the battlefield. That quiet idea would echo through Greek culture for centuries. And as the afternoon sun slowly drifted westward, casting long shadows across olive groves, workshops, village paths, and distant temple columns, another ordinary day continued its unhurried journey through a land where survival required patience. Community depended upon shared labor, and the smallest routines often mattered far more than the grand victories that would later fill history books. As the afternoon warmth gradually softened and longer shadows stretched across the stone streets, another side of life in ancient Greece quietly emerged. The busiest hours of physical labor were beginning to ease, at least during the hottest weeks of summer, and people naturally drifted toward places where conversation was almost as valuable as commerce. For many communities, those places were the agora. Today, we often imagine ancient marketplaces as picturesque collections of neat stalls beneath graceful columns. In reality, they were living, noisy, and occasionally rather chaotic places. The smell of fresh bread mixed with fish brought in from the coast. Potters carefully arranged stacks of newly fired vessels, while trying not to appear overly worried about customers handling them with less care than they deserved. Farmers unloaded baskets of onions, lentils, herbs, grapes, and figs. Merchants loudly praised the quality of goods that, according to neighboring merchants, were obviously inferior. Competition had a very recognizable sound. If someone claimed their olive oil was the finest in Attica, another seller would almost certainly decide that this was an excellent opportunity to explain why it was not. Very little about human salesmanship has changed. Money itself was becoming increasingly familiar throughout much of the Greek world. Earlier generations often relied more heavily upon barter, but by the classical period, many city-states minted their own distinctive coins. Athens became particularly well known for its silver tetradrachms, stamped with the owl of the goddess Athena. The little owl traveled astonishing distances. Coins passed from merchants to sailors, from soldiers to innkeepers, from temple offerings to tax collectors. They crossed seas, changed languages, and quietly connected communities separated by hundreds of miles. It is rather remarkable to imagine a coin leaving an Athenian workshop and eventually finding itself in Egypt, Sicily, or the coast of Asia Minor. Objects can become travelers in ways their owners never intended. Trade, after all, was one of the great invisible threads holding the Greek world together. No single city possessed everything it needed. Some regions produced excellent wine. Others grew abundant grain. Some had valuable timber for shipbuilding. Others mined silver, copper, marble, or iron. Merchant ships became floating marketplaces, carrying cargo from harbor to harbor, while bringing back stories almost as valuable as the goods themselves. The voyage, however, was rarely comfortable. A Greek merchant vessel was built for carrying cargo, not providing luxury accommodation. Passengers slept wherever space permitted. Fresh water had to be rationed carefully. Food remained simple. Storms could transform an ordinary journey into an exhausting struggle lasting days. The sea had an unfortunate habit of reminding people that confidence and control were not quite the same thing. Even experienced captains respected changing weather. Ancient sailors preferred remaining close to land whenever possible. Coastlines offered landmarks, sheltered bays, and opportunities to stop before darkness made navigation far more difficult. Open water crossings certainly occurred, but they required favorable conditions and steady nerves. Navigation relied upon observation rather than elaborate instruments. The position of the sun, the appearance of familiar stars, the direction of prevailing winds, the shape of distant coastlines, the color of the water itself. Generations of accumulated experience often mattered more than written instructions. Meanwhile, while merchants crossed the Mediterranean, another group of travelers wandered the roads for entirely different reasons. Philosophers. The image of a philosopher quietly strolling beneath olive trees discussing virtue is not entirely inaccurate. Many teachers traveled between cities, offering lectures, debates, or private instruction. Some gathered devoted students. Others attracted skeptical audiences who politely listened before deciding. They remained unconvinced. The Greeks enjoyed arguments almost as much as they enjoyed festivals. Perhaps more. One of the most unusual features of Greek intellectual life was the willingness to question assumptions that many other societies simply accepted. What makes a good government? What is justice? Can knowledge truly be certain? What makes a person happy? What is courage? These questions echoed through marketplaces, gymnasiums, private homes, and schools. The answers varied considerably. Socrates famously insisted that recognizing one's own ignorance represented an important beginning. It was a surprisingly humble position for someone who spent much of his time asking questions that left everyone else feeling rather uncomfortable. His student Plato imagined an ideal society governed by philosopher kings. Plato's own student Aristotle became interested in observing the natural world with extraordinary patience. Plants, animals, politics, ethics, poetry, logic. Very little escaped his curiosity. If curiosity earned medals, Aristotle would have required an impressively large trophy cabinet. Of course, not everyone had the leisure to spend afternoons discussing metaphysics. Most Athenians remained occupied with practical responsibilities. Still, ideas circulated remarkably widely. Public speeches attracted crowds. The theater explored political and moral questions. Even ordinary conversations often touched upon civic affairs. Citizenship carried expectations, especially in democratic Athens. Now the word democracy deserves a gentle pause. Athens is often celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, and in many respects that description is fair. Citizens voted directly on important decisions, rather than electing representatives to make every choice for them. Assemblies could include thousands of citizens debating war, alliances, laws, finances, and public policy. It was an extraordinary political experiment. It was also limited. Only adult male citizens possessed full political rights. Women did not vote. Resident foreigners did not vote. Enslaved people certainly did not vote. Children did not vote. The democratic system represented only a portion of the total population. History often advances in gradual, uneven steps rather than dramatic leaps. Even within the citizen body, democracy could become noisy, emotional, and unpredictable. Persuasive speakers gained influence. Crowds occasionally changed their minds with remarkable speed. Popular opinion could elevate one leader and abandon him not long afterward. Political fortunes rose and fell almost as quickly as Mediterranean weather, which, unsurprisingly, solved absolutely nothing when deeper problems remained. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Greece, Sparta quietly observed Athens with a mixture of admiration, suspicion, and profound disagreement. If Athens became known for debate, Sparta became famous for discipline. The two cities approached nearly every aspect of life differently. Sparta possessed no grand philosophical schools comparable to Athens. Instead, it developed one of the most distinctive military societies in ancient history. From childhood, Spartan boys entered the agoge, a rigorous educational and training system designed to prepare them for military service. Life emphasized endurance, obedience, physical strength, self-control. Luxury found few friends in Sparta. Meals remained intentionally simple. Clothing remained modest. Comfort rarely received official encouragement. One famous dish, commonly called black broth, became almost legendary. Its ingredients included pork, blood, salt, and vinegar. Visitors from other Greek cities occasionally struggled to appreciate its culinary appeal. One foreign king reportedly remarked that after tasting Spartan food, he finally understood why Spartans seemed unafraid of dying in battle. Whether the story is entirely authentic remains uncertain. The reputation certainly survived. On the ancient cuisine satisfaction scale, black broth probably inspired passionate opinions rather than universal enthusiasm. Spartan women, however, occupied a somewhat different position than many women elsewhere in Greece. Because Spartan men spent significant portions of their lives training or campaigning, women often managed estates and property with considerable responsibility. Girls also received physical training that would have seemed unusual in many other Greek communities. The Spartan system fascinated outsiders. Some admired it. Others considered it unnecessarily severe. Most agreed it was unlike anywhere else. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta would eventually shape much of Greek history. Yet during quieter years, ordinary people in both societies still worried about familiar concerns: harvests, children, health, marriage, property, weather. The practical realities of life rarely paused simply because politicians disagreed. Marriage itself generally reflected family interests more than romantic ideals. Parents negotiated arrangements. Dowries played important roles. Age differences between husbands and wives could be considerable, especially among wealthier families. Affection certainly developed in many marriages, but companionship often grew gradually rather than beginning as the primary purpose of the union. Households represented economic partnerships as much as emotional ones. Children remained central to family hopes. Sons could inherit property and continue family lines. Daughters strengthened alliances through marriage. Infant mortality, however, remained painfully high. Parents celebrated births while quietly understanding that survival could never be taken for granted. Many families experienced grief that modern statistics can only partially express. Small grave markers discovered by archaeologists still carry names that remind us these were real children, deeply loved despite lives that lasted only months or a few years. History sometimes speaks most softly through its smallest monuments. Religion accompanied these moments of joy and sorrow alike: births, marriages, harvests, voyages, military campaigns, illness, deaths. Each brought its own rituals, sacrifices, or prayers. Temples dominated skylines, but religion lived equally within ordinary homes. Small household shrines honored protective deities. Offerings might include wine, oil, cakes, incense, or flowers. These gestures rarely appeared dramatic. Instead, they formed part of everyday routine, almost like quietly wishing someone good luck before a difficult journey. Festivals punctuated the calendar with welcome interruptions to work. Some honored local gods. Others attracted visitors from across the Greek world. Music echoed through city streets. Animals prepared for sacrifice. Athletic contests drew enthusiastic crowds. Poets recited verses. Actors performed tragedies and comedies before thousands of spectators. The theater itself became one of Greece's greatest cultural achievements. Imagine sitting beneath the open sky in a stone theater carved into a hillside. The audience gradually settles. The chorus enters. Masks amplify expressions visible even to distant spectators. The play explores pride, ambition, loyalty, revenge, justice, or fate. Although myths often supplied the stories, audiences recognized themselves within the characters. Human nature had not changed nearly as much as clothing styles. One remarkable feature of Greek tragedy is its patience. Characters rarely rushed toward disaster. Instead, consequences unfolded gradually. Small decisions accumulated. Warnings went unnoticed. Confidence quietly transformed into overconfidence. Only much later did everyone recognize precisely where things had begun to go wrong. History itself often follows a remarkably similar pattern. As darkness settled gently over the hills and harbors, the pace of life slowed in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Without the glow of electric lights, the evening belonged to small oil lamps, quiet conversations, and the distant sounds of animals settling for the night. The stars seemed brighter than they do now, not because they were any different, but because there was so little to compete with them. Entire generations grew up recognizing constellations almost as easily as they recognized the faces of their neighbors. For sailors, those stars were trusted companions. For farmers, they marked the passing of seasons. For storytellers, they became the homes of heroes, monsters, and gods. And for children lying awake beneath simple wool blankets, they offered endless opportunities to wonder what existed beyond the familiar hills surrounding their homes. Sleep itself followed a different rhythm. Most people rose shortly after sunrise, because daylight determined nearly every activity. During the hottest weeks of summer, many also rested during the afternoon before returning to work as temperatures became more forgiving. There was no universal schedule across the Greek world, but nature exerted far greater influence over daily life than clocks ever could. The next morning would begin much like the last. Yet every day also carried the possibility of unexpected visitors. Hospitality occupied an unusually important place in Greek society. The Greeks called it xenia, a relationship between host and guest governed by customs that were both practical and deeply connected to religion. Travel could be dangerous. Roads were often rough. Inns existed, but they varied considerably in quality. Some offered genuine shelter. Others merely provided walls, a roof, and perhaps a reasonable chance that your belongings would still be present when morning arrived. A welcoming household, therefore, became something far more valuable than a comfortable hotel. When a traveler arrived at a respectable home, the host was generally expected to offer food, water, and a place to rest before asking too many questions. Only after basic needs had been met would conversation begin. The reasoning was simple enough. A hungry stranger was first a human being. His identity could wait until after dinner. This custom appeared repeatedly in Greek literature, especially in Homer's Odyssey, where good hospitality often separated honorable households from deeply unpleasant ones. Of course, not every guest proved worthy of generosity. Not every host behaved admirably either. Human beings remained wonderfully consistent in their ability to complicate even the best traditions. The Odyssey itself explores these tensions through dozens of encounters, but tonight our journey is less concerned with mythical adventures than with the ordinary travelers who quietly moved across Greece every day. Imagine a merchant walking along a dusty road, linking two neighboring city-states. His sandals have accumulated several days' worth of dust. A small mule carries jars of olive oil and woven cloth intended for the next market. The summer sun has been relentless. Finding fresh water before sunset matters more than reaching his destination. Eventually, he notices smoke rising from a farmhouse. Perhaps he is welcomed. Perhaps he pays for a meal. Perhaps he exchanges news from distant cities in return for a place beside the hearth. Information traveled remarkably well through such encounters. Long before newspapers or radio, travelers became living messengers. News of victories, disasters, new laws, successful harvests, strange weather, unusual births, distant earthquakes, and political arguments spread from village to village through countless conversations exactly like these. Naturally, the details sometimes changed along the way. One suspicious pirate could quietly become five. A respectable military victory might gradually transform into an astonishing triumph involving impossible numbers. An ordinary disagreement between politicians occasionally evolved into what sounded remarkably like the end of civilization. Rumors have always enjoyed excellent travel arrangements. As one road carried merchants inland, another led toward one of the most important features of Greek civilization, the sanctuary. Scattered across Greece stood sacred places that drew pilgrims from many different city-states. Among the most famous was Delphi. Nestled high upon the slopes of Mount Parnassus, Delphi occupied an extraordinary position within the Greek imagination. People believed it to be the center of the world. Kings sought advice there. Generals requested guidance before campaigns. Colonists consulted the oracle before founding new settlements. Ordinary individuals also arrived with deeply personal questions. Should they marry? Should they travel? Should they invest family resources in one opportunity rather than another? The priestess known as the Pythia delivered responses inspired by Apollo, though those responses often possessed a delightful talent for multiple interpretations. One famous ruler, Croesus of Lydia, asked whether he should wage war against Persia. The oracle reportedly answered that if he crossed the river, a great empire would fall. This prediction proved entirely accurate. The empire that collapsed simply happened to be his own. Ancient oracles possessed an enviable ability to remain technically correct. Meanwhile, pilgrims climbing toward Delphi encountered impressive temples, treasuries filled with offerings from wealthy city-states, statues commemorating victories, and inscriptions encouraging thoughtful living. One particularly famous phrase reads simply, "Know thyself." It remains remarkably good advice. Admittedly, following it has always been rather more difficult. Elsewhere in Greece, another great sanctuary gathered visitors for a very different purpose, Olympia. Today, the Olympic Games are celebrated as one of the world's largest sporting events. Their ancient beginnings, however, were deeply religious. Held every 4 years in honor of Zeus, the festival attracted athletes and spectators from across the Greek-speaking world. During the Games, many conflicts paused under a sacred truce that allowed participants to travel safely. It was an impressive achievement, considering how frequently Greek city-states disagreed with one another. For a brief period, athletic competition replaced military competition. At least officially. The events themselves demanded extraordinary physical ability: running, wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, horse racing, chariot racing. Victorious athletes returned home with immense prestige. Some received free meals for life. Others gained public honors, statues, or generous financial rewards from grateful cities eager to celebrate local success. One successful athlete could become nearly as famous as a victorious general. Interestingly, the prize awarded at Olympia itself remained surprisingly modest. A wreath woven from olive branches. No gold medals. No enormous trophies. No endorsement contracts. Just honor. Admittedly, the fame accompanying that olive wreath often produced rather pleasant practical benefits afterward. Training for these competitions required dedication that bordered upon obsession. Young men exercised in gymnasiums, where physical education blended with intellectual discussion. The Greek word gymnos means naked, reflecting the fact that athletes generally trained and competed without clothing. To modern visitors, this detail often comes as a surprise. To the Greeks, it represented the natural way to celebrate physical excellence. Cultural expectations are curious things. They often seem perfectly ordinary until viewed from another century. Gymnasiums became centers not only for athletics, but also for conversation. Teachers gathered students. Philosophers lectured beneath shaded walkways. Friendships developed. Political opinions circulated. Exercise and education comfortably shared the same space. The Greeks generally admired harmony between body and mind. Neither was considered complete without the other. Meanwhile, while athletes pursued glory and philosophers debated wisdom, thousands of artisans quietly continued producing the objects that filled everyday life. Let's step inside the workshop of a potter. The room smells faintly of damp clay and wood smoke. Rows of unfinished vessels dry carefully along the walls. The potter sits before a simple wheel, hands steady after years of practice. A lump of clay slowly rises beneath gentle pressure. First a bowl, then a cup, then an elegant storage jar. Each movement appears effortless. It is anything but. Mastering the wheel required patience measured in years. One careless moment could collapse an otherwise perfect vessel back into an untidy mound of clay. Fortunately, clay is forgiving. It offers second chances. Life occasionally does the same. After shaping came decoration. Some artists painted elaborate scenes from mythology. Others depicted weddings, athletic contests, musicians, banquets, soldiers, or everyday domestic life. Many never imagined that 25 centuries later historians would study their work with magnifying glasses in carefully controlled museum lighting. To them, it was simply another commission. Perhaps due next week. Deadlines have ancient origins. Nearby, another craftsman works with bronze. The rhythmic sound of hammer against metal echoes through narrow streets. Bronze remained one of the most valuable materials in the Greek world. Weapons, armor, helmets, shields, statues. Cooking vessels, door fittings, tools. The metal appeared almost everywhere. Producing it, however, demanded remarkable expertise. Copper and tin rarely came from the same place. Trade networks connected distant mines with local workshops, reminding us once again that even small Greek communities depended upon an impressively wide world. Iron also became increasingly common over time, particularly for tools and weapons. Unlike bronze, iron ore existed more widely, though working it required higher temperatures and different techniques. Blacksmiths occupied an important place within every community. A farmer with a broken plow or a carpenter needing new nails quickly learned the value of a skilled smith. On the ancient occupation appreciation scale, competent blacksmiths ranked comfortably near the top. Without them, daily life became inconvenient rather quickly. As the afternoon breeze carried the scent of pine and wild thyme across the hills, children continued playing simple games in narrow streets. Some rolled hoops. Others tossed knucklestones, the ancient equivalent of dice. Balls stuffed with wool or hair bounced between laughing friends. Hide and seek apparently required very little technological innovation. Certain forms of entertainment remain wonderfully resistant to history. Parents occasionally watched with quiet amusement. occasionally with understandable concern. Children possess the same astonishing ability to discover danger that they do today. Only the architecture has changed. And so another ordinary day unfolded beneath the bright Mediterranean sky, where merchants bargained, pilgrims prayed, athletes trained, craftsmen worked, travelers wandered, philosophers questioned, and families quietly carried on with lives that rarely appeared in epic poems, yet formed the true foundation of the civilization that continues to shape so much of the modern world. Morning returned once again with the familiar chorus of birds, restless livestock, and the first faint sounds of wooden doors opening onto narrow streets. Smoke began curling upward from household hearths as families prepared another simple breakfast, and before long, the cities and villages of Greece slipped almost effortlessly back into their well-practiced routines. If there is one lesson that quietly emerges from spending time among ordinary Greeks, it is that history is built far more often by repetition than by extraordinary moments. A farmer watered his vines. A fisherman repaired his nets. A potter shaped another jar. A child carried water from the public fountain. A mother spun wool into thread. A merchant counted coins before opening his stall. Thousands upon thousands of these ordinary mornings accumulated into centuries. The famous battles, speeches, and dramatic political debates were real enough, but they rested upon an enormous foundation of people simply doing what needed to be done. Let's wander now toward one of the busiest places in any Greek city, after the marketplace. The harbor. Long before a traveler could actually see the sea, there were clues that it lay nearby. The smell of salt drifted inland. Seagulls circled overhead with determined optimism. Ropes creaked against wooden docks. Somewhere, someone was shouting instructions that sounded urgent whether they actually were or not. Ports like the Piraeus, serving Athens, never truly seemed to rest. Merchant ships arrived carrying grain from Egypt, timber from Macedonia, fine fabrics from the eastern Mediterranean, spices that had traveled astonishing distances, copper from Cyprus, and countless other goods that reminded everyone how interconnected the ancient world had become. At the same time, Greek ships departed carrying pottery, olive oil, wine, metalwork, marble, and beautifully crafted goods whose reputation stretched far beyond Greece itself. The Mediterranean was less a barrier than a remarkably busy road. Its waters connected cultures that spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and governed themselves in entirely different ways. Yet trade encouraged cooperation where politics often failed. A merchant generally preferred a reliable customer to a glorious military victory. Invoices rarely cared about ideology. Standing beside the docks, one could watch sailors loading heavy amphorae into the hold of a merchant vessel. These large ceramic containers became the shipping crates of the ancient world. Filled with wine, olive oil, salted fish, grain, or preserved fruit, amphorae were stacked carefully to maximize space while preventing them from shifting dangerously during rough weather. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of them resting on the seabed, silent reminders that not every voyage ended successfully. The Mediterranean could be generous. It could also become astonishingly unforgiving. Storms arrived with little warning. Powerful winds pushed vessels onto hidden rocks. Ships sprang leaks. Cargo shifted unexpectedly. Navigation errors accumulated into disasters. Even experienced captains, accepted that some journeys simply depended upon fortune. Many sailors offered prayers before departure. Few considered that excessive caution. Meanwhile, not every danger came from nature. Piracy remained a persistent concern throughout much of Greek history. Small, fast vessels sometimes targeted slower merchant ships carrying valuable cargo. The lines separating pirate, private adventurer, mercenary, and naval auxiliary occasionally became rather blurred depending upon which government happened to be writing the official records. History has always displayed remarkable flexibility when assigning respectable job titles. For merchants, however, the distinction mattered very little. Losing one's cargo generally produced the same disappointing financial outcome, regardless of the attacker's preferred description. Back on land, another important feature of Greek life quietly shaped nearly every family: marriage. Modern ideas of romance should be set gently aside for a moment. Marriage in ancient Greece primarily represented the joining of households rather than the celebration of personal affection. Families considered reputation, property, political alliances, dowries, social standing. Compatibility often meant practical compatibility. Love, when it developed, frequently grew over time instead of preceding the wedding. Among wealthier families, negotiations surrounding marriage could become surprisingly detailed. A dowry provided by the bride's family helped establish the new household and offered financial security should circumstances later change. For fathers arranging marriages, choosing wisely carried long-term consequences. Selecting poorly might create decades of family tension. Some experiences truly are universal. Wedding ceremonies themselves combined religious ritual with celebration. Offerings honored the gods. Relatives gathered. Music filled the air. Special meals brought families together. The bride often traveled ceremonially to her new home after nightfall, marking her transition into a different household. For many young women, the experience must have felt both hopeful and deeply uncertain. Most had little opportunity to influence the decision itself. Marriage also marked the beginning of new responsibilities. Running a household required organization that modern readers sometimes underestimate. Food had to be stored carefully. Grain needed grinding into flour. Clothing required constant repair. Oil lamps had to remain supplied. Water jars refilled. Children supervised. Servants, if the household possessed them, directed efficiently. Every day presented dozens of practical tasks. There were no washing machines, no refrigerators, no supermarkets waiting conveniently around the corner. Every loaf of bread represented labor. Every woven garment represented weeks of work. Every successful household reflected countless hours of careful management. Meanwhile, children gradually learned the rhythms of adult life by participating in them. A boy accompanying his father into the fields observed far more than farming techniques. He learned patience, timing, the importance of weather, how to negotiate with neighbors, how to recognize changing seasons. A girl helping within the household learned textile production, food preparation, religious customs, and domestic management through observation and practice rather than formal lessons. Knowledge flowed naturally between generations. There were no instructional videos, only experience, and occasionally a grandparent offering corrections with absolute confidence. Grandparents have been certain they know the proper method for thousands of years. Sometimes they were entirely correct. Elsewhere in the cities, education expanded beyond practical skills for families who could afford it. Teachers introduced boys to reading and writing, using wax tablets before progressing to papyrus scrolls. Writing itself required patience. Papyrus remained valuable. Mistakes could become expensive. Students copied passages from Homer, practiced arithmetic, and memorized poetry intended to strengthen both memory and character. Discipline could be strict. Some teachers believed that learning and discomfort enjoyed a productive relationship. Their students occasionally disagreed. Music also occupied an important place in education. Young Greeks learned to play instruments such as the lyre or the aulos, a double-piped wind instrument whose lively sound accompanied festivals, ceremonies, and theatrical performances. To educated Greeks, music represented more than entertainment. It shaped the soul. Different musical modes were even believed to influence character in different ways. Modern listeners might smile at such confidence. Then again, many people today insist they cannot work without exactly the right playlist. Perhaps the underlying idea has not entirely disappeared. Let's drift gently toward another remarkable aspect of Greek civilization: the theater. Few cultures have influenced dramatic storytelling more profoundly than the ancient Greeks. Large open-air theaters appeared throughout the Greek world, carefully designed so that voices carried astonishing distances. Thousands of spectators gathered beneath the open sky to watch tragedies and comedies during religious festivals honoring Dionysus. Imagine taking your place among the audience as the sun rises over the hillside. The seats are carved from stone. The air still carries the coolness of morning. Around you, neighbors greet one another while vendors circulate through the growing crowd. Then the performance begins. Actors wear elaborate masks that exaggerate expressions visible even from the highest rows. Their costumes identify kings, queens, messengers, warriors, or gods. A chorus enters together, singing and moving rhythmically while commenting upon the unfolding events. Unlike modern plays, the chorus remained an essential character in its own right, guiding audiences through emotional and moral questions. The stories themselves often came from familiar myths. Everyone already knew what would happen to Oedipus. Everyone understood the fate awaiting Agamemnon's family. The interest lay not in surprise, but in watching familiar tragedies unfold with fresh insight. There is something oddly comforting about revisiting stories whose endings are already known. Perhaps that is one reason people still return to them after so many centuries. Comedy occupied an equally important place. Playwrights such as Aristophanes delighted audiences by gently, or sometimes not so gently, mocking politicians, philosophers, military leaders, and fashionable ideas. Public figures occasionally discovered they had become the evening's principal joke before several thousand spectators. Not everyone appreciated the honor. Still, comedy served an important social purpose. Laughter allowed communities to examine themselves. Even democracy benefited from a little gentle teasing, now and then, which, unsurprisingly, some politicians enjoyed rather less than everyone else. As afternoon faded into evening once more, families returned home carrying purchases from the marketplace, Fishermen secured their boats against the night's changing tides. Shepherds counted their flocks beneath the soft glow of the setting sun, and children gradually surrendered to sleep, while older generations exchanged stories beside flickering oil lamps. Beyond the rooftops, beyond the olive groves, and beyond the countless islands scattered across the shimmering Aegean, another ordinary day quietly joined the thousands that had come before it. Days filled not with legendary heroes or impossible monsters, but with ordinary people whose patient labor, quiet resilience, and familiar routines formed the true heartbeat of ancient Greece. By now, after wandering through markets, harbors, farms, workshops, and family homes, ancient Greece has begun to feel a little less like a distant civilization carved entirely from white marble, and a little more like a place where ordinary people simply tried to make it through another year. History often remembers the speeches delivered in assembly halls. It is less generous toward the baker who woke before dawn every morning for 40 years, or the woman who spent countless evenings repairing clothing by the light of a single olive oil lamp, or the fisherman who knew every current along his stretch of coastline, but never expected anyone to write his name down. Yet together, these people formed the overwhelming majority of Greek society. And their lives, though quieter, were no less fascinating. Let's spend some time with one of the most common professions in the Greek world: the fisherman. Before sunrise, while much of the city remained asleep, small boats were already pushing away from sheltered beaches. The sea looked almost silver beneath the fading stars, interrupted only by gentle ripples spreading behind each vessel. Fishing demanded patience more than strength. Nets had to be repaired constantly. Hooks were carefully fashioned from bronze or iron. Weather had to be watched with almost instinctive attention. The sea rewarded experience, but it rarely forgave carelessness. A successful morning might bring sea bream, mullet, sardines, anchovies, squid, or octopus, depending on the region and season. Some fish would be sold fresh before the afternoon heat arrived. Others were salted for preservation. Salt itself became almost as valuable as the catch. Without refrigeration, preservation meant survival. The smell of drying fish lingered around many coastal communities. Visitors probably noticed it immediately. Residents likely stopped noticing years earlier. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to adapt to familiar surroundings. The same held true for sounds. The creaking of wooden ships, the rhythmic tapping of a blacksmith's hammer, the distant bleating of sheep, the chatter of neighbors crossing narrow streets, the steady turning of a potter's wheel. Collectively, they formed the soundtrack of everyday Greece. Imagine walking through Athens with your eyes closed for just a moment. You would hear sandals scraping over stone, children laughing somewhere nearby, a merchant calling attention to today's freshest olives, donkeys objecting to another heavy load, someone practicing the lyre inside a courtyard. Temple bells did not ring in the way later church bells would, but religious chants and ceremonial music occasionally drifted across public spaces. Cities possessed their own unique rhythm. One curious feature of Greek towns was their relationship with public fountains. Fresh water remained essential, and many communities invested considerable effort into securing reliable supplies. Some cities built aqueducts. Others depended upon wells or natural springs. Public fountains quickly became social gathering places. People met neighbors while collecting water. News spread. Friendships developed. Minor disagreements occasionally emerged over whose turn came next. Waiting in line, it seems, has inspired gentle frustration throughout human history. Nearby, craftsmen opened their workshops one by one. Carpenters measured timber with practiced eyes. Leatherworkers softened hides. Stonecutters shaped marble blocks destined for temples, homes, or grave markers. Goldsmiths worked patiently beneath excellent lighting, creating jewelry delicate enough to pass from one generation to the next. The division of labor became increasingly specialized in larger cities. An experienced artisan could spend decades mastering a single craft. Their reputation mattered enormously. A well-known potter or sculptor attracted customers from distant communities. Word-of-mouth recommendations functioned quite effectively long before printed advertisements. Satisfied customers have always been valuable. Dissatisfied ones have generally spoken louder. Let's drift gently toward another important part of Greek society: slavery. It is impossible to understand ancient Greece honestly without acknowledging its presence. Enslaved people lived in nearly every Greek city-state, although their experiences varied widely depending on where they lived and what work they performed. Some labored in households, cooking meals, caring for children, weaving cloth, or managing domestic tasks. Others worked as skilled craftsmen. Some served as tutors or clerks. Many endured far harsher conditions in agriculture or, especially, in mines. The silver mines at Laurion near Athens became particularly infamous. Mining was exhausting and dangerous. Dark tunnels stretched underground. Air circulation remained poor. Accidents occurred. The physical demands were relentless. The wealth generated by these mines helped finance Athenian naval power and many public projects. Behind remarkable achievements often stood invisible labor. Ancient Greek philosophers, despite their extraordinary contributions in many fields, generally accepted slavery as part of the social order. A few questioned aspects of it. Most did not. Understanding history sometimes requires acknowledging uncomfortable realities without pretending they did not exist. Meanwhile, above ground, the political life of Athens continued. The assembly met regularly. Citizens debated proposals concerning taxation, military campaigns, alliances, and public spending. Anyone eligible could speak. Not everyone should have. Lengthy speeches occasionally wandered far from the original topic. Confident speakers sometimes possessed considerably more confidence than wisdom. Modern parliamentary sessions may feel strangely familiar in this respect. Votes determined important decisions, yet democracy remained demanding. Participation required time. Travel into the city. Attention. Responsibility. Citizenship was considered an active duty rather than merely a legal status. One particularly unusual Athenian practice was ostracism. Once each year, citizens could vote on whether someone had become dangerously influential. If enough people agreed, they wrote that person's name on broken pieces of pottery called ostraka. The individual receiving the most votes could be required to leave Athens for 10 years. Their property remained untouched. Their family generally remained safe. It was exile rather than execution. An unusual solution to political tension. Rather like deciding that everyone might appreciate a particularly argumentative neighbor, taking a very long holiday. Not every year resulted in an ostracism. When it did, the process reflected the Athenians' determination to prevent any one citizen from accumulating excessive power. Whether it always achieved that goal remains open to debate. As one political discussion quietly ended, another equally important institution continued shaping Greek life. The family. Respect for ancestors remained strong. Family tombs often stood outside city walls. Visitors brought offerings. Memories passed between generations. Children inherited not only property, but obligations, traditions, and expectations. A family's reputation extended backward through grandparents and forward toward descendants, yet unborn. Names carried weight. Honor mattered deeply. Losing public respect could prove more painful than losing money. Although, naturally, losing both at the same time remained particularly inconvenient. Meals continued to bring households together whenever work allowed. The largest meal often occurred later in the day. Bread remained central. Olives appeared almost without fail. Vegetables simmered into hearty stews. Cheese accompanied fresh fruit. Wine mixed carefully with water-filled ceramic cups. Those wealthy enough to serve fish or meat did so with understandable pride. Guests reclined on couches during formal banquets, particularly among elite men. Servants circulated quietly. Musicians entertained. Conversation wandered between philosophy, politics, poetry, military affairs, and occasionally who possessed the finest vineyard. Some debates became impressively detailed. One suspects the wine occasionally contributed. Because of course it did. Banquets also revealed differences within society. Elite households possessed decorated pottery, imported goods, fine furniture, and multiple servants. Poor families lived much more simply. Yet certain pleasures crossed social boundaries. Fresh bread, a successful harvest, healthy children, cool shade during a summer afternoon, good neighbors, a peaceful evening. These comforts required no great wealth. Let's pause beside one of Greece's quieter landscapes. Far from crowded cities, shepherds guide flocks across hills covered with thyme, sage, and wild flowers. The wind carries the scent of pine forests. Cicadas sing relentlessly beneath the afternoon sun. Above, eagles circle slowly on rising currents of warm air. It is easy to understand why so many Greek myths unfolded in forests, mountains, caves, and lonely valleys. Nature remained close. One rarely traveled far without encountering places that inspired imagination. A cave became the birthplace of Zeus. A spring belonged to a nymph. A grove honored Artemis. A mountain sheltered mysterious spirits. The boundary between landscape and legend remained pleasantly blurred. Children grew up hearing these stories while surrounded by scenery that seemed perfectly capable of producing them. Not every unusual rock required a scientific explanation. Sometimes a good story proved far more satisfying. On our royal misery scale, however, shepherds occasionally enjoyed rather respectable scores. Away from political intrigue, court rivalries, and endless debates, they answered mainly to weather, wandering sheep, and the occasional determined wolf. None of those were especially easy. They were simply refreshingly honest. As evening approached once more, cool air slowly replaced the heat of the day. Families gathered inside courtyards. Oil lamps flickered gently. Dogs settled near doorways after another successful day of announcing every passing stranger. Somewhere a grandfather began telling a familiar story that every child claimed to know already. Yet no one interrupted him. There was comfort in hearing it again. The words had become part of the rhythm of home. And perhaps that quiet rhythm, repeated across thousands of households from the mountains of mainland Greece to the islands scattered across the Aegean Sea, explains more about the endurance of Greek civilization than any single battle, famous speech, or legendary hero ever could. The years passed quietly for most people. Kings might rise and fall. Alliances shifted with surprising regularity. Famous generals marched across maps that future historians would study in careful detail. Philosophers continued asking questions that still occupy university classrooms today. Yet for the overwhelming majority of people living in ancient Greece, the passing of history was noticed through smaller changes. A child became old enough to help in the fields. An olive grove produced its first worthwhile harvest. A roof needed replacing after another winter of rain. A neighbor's daughter was married. A familiar fisherman failed to return from the sea. Another generation quietly took its place. Life unfolded not in dramatic chapters, but in thousands of ordinary moments. Let's spend some time considering the houses themselves. The grand villas occasionally shown in films certainly existed for the wealthy, but most Greek homes were far more modest. From the street, many appeared almost plain. Exterior walls were often built from stone, mud brick, or a combination of local materials. Windows facing the street remained small and were usually positioned high enough to provide privacy while allowing some light inside. The real life of the household centered around an inner courtyard. Here children played while remaining within the relative safety of the home. Here women spun wool or prepared meals. Here family shared conversations during cooler evenings. Potted herbs might grow beside a small altar dedicated to household gods. Rainwater collected in cisterns when possible. A household cat occasionally wandered through in search of rodents that had entirely different plans for the family's grain stores. Cats, fortunately, had their own strong opinions about pest control. Dogs served somewhat different roles. Many acted as guards rather than affectionate companions in the modern sense. They barked at strangers, protected livestock, and accompanied shepherds across hillsides. Hunting dogs were especially prized among wealthier Greeks who enjoyed pursuing deer, wild boar, and hares. Hunting itself occupied an interesting place within Greek society. For aristocratic families, it demonstrated physical skill, endurance, and discipline. Young men learned to ride, throw spears, and cooperate with hunting dogs. Success depended less upon luck than careful observation of animal behavior. Wild boar, in particular, possessed an intimidating reputation. Unlike deer, they had little interest in fleeing politely. Several Greek myths and historical accounts describe hunts ending rather badly for overconfident participants. Nature occasionally reminded humanity that confidence alone did not guarantee success. Speaking of animals, horses deserve a quiet moment. Contrary to popular imagination, most Greeks did not own horses. They were expensive to breed, feed, and maintain. Only wealthier citizens or the state itself could regularly afford cavalry animals. For ordinary people, donkeys, Mules and oxen proved far more practical. A sturdy donkey carried heavy loads across narrow mountain paths with admirable determination. A mule combined strength with endurance. Oxen patiently pulled plows through rocky soil. They lacked the dramatic elegance of heroic war horses, but they contributed immeasurably more to everyday survival. History has a tendency to celebrate the horse while quietly overlooking the donkey. The donkey rarely seemed bothered by this arrangement. Its priorities remained pleasantly uncomplicated. Let's drift gently toward another cornerstone of Greek life, religion. Earlier, we visited temples and festivals, but religion extended into countless small rituals that marked ordinary days. Before meals, families might offer a few drops of wine to the gods. Travelers prayed before beginning difficult journeys. Sailors made offerings before launching their ships. Farmers sought divine favor before planting. Even crossing the threshold of a new home could involve simple ceremonies intended to invite protection and good fortune. These practices were not necessarily dramatic displays of devotion. They formed habits, part of everyday routine, rather like checking the weather before leaving home. Sacred spaces appeared almost everywhere. A solitary tree might become associated with a local deity. A spring could be considered especially holy. Small roadside shrines reminded travelers that the divine world existed alongside the human one, rather than somewhere far removed from it. Festivals continued to punctuate the calendar with welcome moments of celebration. The Panathenaic festival in Athens honored Athena, the city's patron goddess. Processions wound through the streets. Musicians played. Sacrifices were offered. Athletic competitions attracted enthusiastic crowds. Beautiful woven robes, called peploi, were presented to the goddess's statue atop the Acropolis. Imagine climbing that sacred hill among thousands of fellow citizens. The white marble temples gleam beneath bright sunlight. Incense drifts gently through the air. Priests prepare offerings while musicians accompany the ceremony. The enormous bronze statues catch the light. Below, Athens spreads across the landscape toward the distant sea. Even today, the Acropolis remains an extraordinary sight. In antiquity, when every building was newly completed and many sculptures were brightly painted rather than plain white, the impression must have been even more striking. That often surprises modern visitors. Greek temples and statues were not originally the pure white monuments we commonly imagine. Many were vividly painted with reds, blues, greens, blacks, and gold. Time gradually stripped away most of those colors, leaving the marble beneath. History occasionally changes its appearance simply by surviving. One curious detail concerns perfume. Ancient Greeks appreciated pleasant scents immensely. Olive oil infused with herbs, flowers, or spices became popular among both men and women, especially within wealthier households. Perfume served practical purposes as well. After long days of physical labor beneath a hot Mediterranean sun, fragrant oils undoubtedly improved social interactions. One suspect's neighbors quietly appreciated the effort. Speaking of social interactions, friendships occupied an important place in Greek life. Men often spent time together in gymnasiums, workshops, military service, religious festivals, or the agora. Shared experiences created lasting bonds. Women developed networks within households, neighborhoods, and religious gatherings. Communities depended upon cooperation. Harvests occasionally required extra hands. Building projects benefited from neighbors helping neighbors. Funerals brought families together. Celebrations did the same. Life remained difficult enough that isolation rarely proved practical. Even arguments reflected familiarity. Neighbors who had disagreed over boundary stones for 20 years still borrowed tools from one another when necessary. Human relationships have always possessed remarkable flexibility. Let's visit another aspect of life that every family eventually faced: old age. Those fortunate enough to reach advanced years earned considerable respect. Life expectancy at birth was relatively low because so many children died young, but individuals who survived childhood could certainly live into their 60s, 70s, or beyond. Gray hair represented experience. Grandparents became living libraries. They remembered droughts, wars, exceptional harvests, political upheavals, stories no written record preserved. Their memories connected younger generations with a past that felt immediate rather than distant. Imagine an elderly grandfather sitting beneath the shade of an olive tree while grandchildren gather around. He recalls hearing stories from someone who had actually fought during the Persian Wars. Suddenly, events modern readers place neatly within history books become personal memories, passed from one voice to another. History breathes differently when spoken aloud. Death itself remained a familiar companion. Without modern medicine, even ordinary illnesses could become serious. Communities therefore developed careful funeral customs, emphasizing dignity and remembrance. The deceased were washed, prepared, and mourned by family members. Funeral processions moved quietly beyond city walls toward burial grounds. Simple grave markers identified many ordinary people. Wealthier families sometimes commissioned elaborate monuments decorated with touching scenes of farewell. Interestingly, many surviving gravestones avoid dramatic displays of grief. Instead, they often portray calm moments. A handshake, a seated woman opening a jewelry box, parents bidding farewell to children. These sculptures possess remarkable gentleness. They remind us that behind famous civilizations lived ordinary people, experiencing the same love and loss familiar to every generation. As one family mourned, another welcomed new life. The cycle continued. Seasons changed. Children grew. Fields were planted. Ships departed. Markets reopened. The rhythm never truly stopped. Occasionally, however, events arrived that interrupted ordinary existence completely. Earthquakes. The Greek world lay within an active seismic region. Buildings shook. Walls cracked. Temples suffered damage. People naturally interpreted such events through both practical experience and religious belief. Poseidon, god of the sea, also carried the title Earth Shaker. When the ground itself suddenly moved beneath one's feet, that title must have felt entirely appropriate. Rebuilding became another ordinary skill. Communities repaired damaged homes using familiar techniques and available materials. Resilience quietly became part of everyday life. On the royal misery scale, an earthquake naturally scored rather high. Fortunately, they remained infrequent enough that most people spent far more time worrying about harvests than trembling ground. As evening slowly settled once more over Greece, smoke rose from countless hearths, Shepherds guided their flocks into sheltered enclosures. Fishing boats returned with the day's catch, and children gradually surrendered to sleep beneath woven blankets while elders exchanged stories that had already crossed several generations. Above them, the same stars watched silently over temples, farms, villages, bustling ports, lonely mountain paths, and quiet island coves, patiently observing a civilization whose greatest achievement may not have been any single monument or military victory, but its remarkable ability to weave philosophy, craftsmanship, family, faith, curiosity, and ordinary daily life into a culture whose echoes continue to reach us across more than 2 millennia. As our slow walk through ancient Greece begins its final stretch, it is worth lingering for a little while longer among the ordinary people whose lives rarely became the subjects of epic poems. They were the quiet majority. They built homes one stone at a time, planted trees whose shade they might never fully enjoy, repaired fishing nets after long days at sea, and watched children grow into adults who would inherit both their hopes and their worries. Their names have mostly disappeared. Their routines have not. Even now, in villages scattered around the Mediterranean, there are mornings that begin with the smell of fresh bread, the sound of distant church bells replacing ancient temple chants, and old olive trees still standing where generations before us once worked beneath the same summer sun. History often survives through habits as much as monuments. If we could spend one completely ordinary day in ancient Greece, without the interruptions of famous battles or legendary heroes, we might be surprised by how familiar much of it would feel. Someone would wake before everyone else to prepare food. Someone would complain about the weather. Someone would worry about paying a debt. Children would race each other down a dusty path, despite repeated instructions not to. A merchant would insist that today's prices were entirely reasonable. A customer would politely disagree. Neighbors would exchange gossip over water jars. A shepherd would count sheep twice, because one always seemed determined to disappear at exactly the wrong moment. Some traditions appear wonderfully immune to the passing of centuries. Let's imagine, just for a few quiet moments, a family gathered outside their home on a warm spring evening. The day's work is finally finished. Simple wooden stools have been carried into the courtyard, where a gentle breeze makes the air pleasantly cool. An oil lamp flickers softly on a low table. Bread, olives, cheese, and a little wine mixed carefully with water are shared between family members. No one is rushing. The fields cannot be worked after dark. The marketplace has already closed. Fishing boats have returned to shore. For a little while, there is nothing more urgent than conversation. Perhaps an elderly grandmother begins telling a story she first heard as a child. Not a tale of kings. Not a story about impossible monsters. Just a memory of an unusually harsh winter, a remarkable harvest, or the time a stubborn donkey somehow wandered into a neighbor's vineyard and behaved exactly as donkeys have always behaved. The children laugh. The adults smile because they already know the ending. No one minds hearing it again. Some stories become comfortable precisely because they never change. Elsewhere, on another island, sailors prepare for tomorrow's departure. They carefully inspect ropes worn by salt and wind. Cargo is secured inside rows of amphorae. Fresh water is loaded aboard. The captain studies the evening sky, quietly considering tomorrow's weather. His experience tells him as much as any instrument possibly could. The stars overhead will guide him, once sunrise fades behind the western horizon. For now, however, he enjoys the silence before another journey begins. Not every voyage sought glory. Most sought customers. Across Greece, farmers finish one final inspection of their fields before darkness settles completely. The grapevines appear healthy. Young olive trees continue growing slowly. Stone walls repaired during the afternoon remain standing, at least for the moment. Tomorrow there will always be more work. There always was. That certainty somehow becomes strangely comforting. The seasons themselves provided structure. Spring brought planting. Summer demanded endurance beneath relentless sunshine. Autumn rewarded careful labor with harvests. Winter encouraged repairs, storytelling, weaving, and preparation for another year. The rhythm repeated across generations with remarkable consistency. Empires rose beyond Greece. Empires fell. The olive harvest continued. Perhaps that quiet persistence explains why olive trees became such enduring symbols throughout the Mediterranean world. Some trees planted during antiquity survived for centuries. Many of their descendants still produce fruit today. The hands harvesting them have changed countless times. The trees continue almost without noticing. Meanwhile, children gradually became adults. A young apprentice who spent years watching a master potter eventually shaped elegant vessels of his own. A shepherd entrusted with only a handful of sheep inherited an entire flock. A daughter who once learned weaving from her mother patiently taught those same skills to her own children. Knowledge rarely traveled in dramatic leaps. It passed gently from one pair of hands to another. One generation borrowed from the previous one and quietly added something of its own. This may be one of history's greatest achievements. Not the sudden brilliance of extraordinary individuals, but the steady accumulation of ordinary experience. The Greeks certainly produced remarkable thinkers. Socrates questioned assumptions with relentless patience. Plato imagined ideal societies that scholars still debate. Aristotle observed nature with extraordinary curiosity. Euclid, a little later in the broader Greek tradition, organized geometry in ways that shaped mathematics for centuries. Archimedes would eventually astonish the ancient world with insights into mechanics and engineering. Hippocrates became associated with careful medical observation. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides tried to understand not simply what happened, but why. Yet even these famous names depended upon the world surrounding them. Someone built the schools. Someone copied the scrolls. Someone harvested the grain feeding entire cities. Someone crafted the writing tablets. Someone mined the metals used to produce tools. Civilizations resemble enormous tapestries. The brightest threads attract immediate attention. Remove the quieter threads beneath them, and the entire pattern slowly begins to unravel. Ancient Greece also reminds us that remarkable achievements often existed alongside profound contradictions. Athens celebrated democracy while excluding much of its population from political participation. Philosophers explored justice while generally accepting slavery as an ordinary institution. Magnificent temples honored wisdom, yet rival city-states repeatedly exhausted themselves through warfare. Human societies have always possessed this complicated mixture of brilliance and limitation. Recognizing both allows us to appreciate the past honestly rather than romantically. One curious observation quietly lingers after spending so much time here. The Greeks argued about nearly everything: government honor, education, religion, poetry, military strategy, the proper way to raise children, the ideal balance between wealth and moderation, the best methods of philosophy, the correct preparation of food, the value of music, the responsibilities of citizenship. Managing the family tree occasionally became only slightly less complicated than remembering every password you've ever forgotten. Despite these disagreements, or perhaps partly because of them, they developed habits of questioning that would influence countless later civilizations. Curiosity became one of their greatest exports. Not every answer survived. Many of the questions did. On our royal misery scale, the average Greek ruler probably experienced a thoroughly respectable score. Dynastic marriages produced awkward alliances. Successions inspired endless uncertainty. Military campaigns consumed fortunes. Political rivals multiplied with surprising efficiency. The crown, as it so often turned out, looked considerably more comfortable from a distance. Ordinary farmers observing these developments from their vineyards may have quietly concluded that growing olives involved fewer conspiracies. They were probably correct. As night deepens across our imagined Greece, the sounds gradually become fewer. The marketplace falls silent. Harbor ropes creak gently against wooden docks. Dogs curl beside familiar doorways after another successful evening of warning, everyone about absolutely everything. Crickets replace the bustle of daytime conversation. Somewhere in the distance, waves meet a rocky shoreline with patient regularity. Oil lamps burn lower. Families drift toward sleep. Above them stretches the same sky that watched Homer compose poetry. Shepherds guide their flocks. Philosophers debate beneath shaded colonnades. Athletes compete at Olympia. Merchants sail toward distant harbors. And generations of ordinary people simply live their lives one quiet day at a time. Those stars remain with us still. The temples may stand in ruins. The city walls have weathered. The marketplaces have fallen silent. Yet many of the ideas born beneath those skies continue their own long journey. Questions about justice, curiosity about nature, the importance of careful observation, the value of thoughtful debate, the joy of storytelling, the comfort of family traditions, the quiet satisfaction of mastering a craft, the hope that tomorrow's harvest will be just a little better than this year's. Some things change remarkably little. Perhaps that is the real Odyssey. Not the adventures of one legendary hero struggling to return home across dangerous seas, but the long, patient voyage of ordinary humanity itself. Generation after generation setting out each morning, with no certainty beyond the work waiting to be done. Planting trees whose fruit they might never taste. Building homes future families would inherit. Passing stories to children who would one day become storytellers themselves. Leaving behind traces so ordinary that they almost disappear, yet so essential that no civilization could exist without them. And so our sleepy journey comes to an end. History rarely learned its lessons. Royalty rarely improved their decisions. Philosophers rarely stopped asking difficult questions. And somehow humanity kept moving forward anyway. The fires in the hearths slowly faded. The fishing boats rested quietly in their harbors. The olive groves whispered softly beneath the evening breeze. The stars kept their silent watch over Greece, just as they always had. And, little by little, the ancient world settled peacefully into the night.